The automatic doors of Vista Trust hissed open, and Ethan Moore stepped into the cool, polished expanse of the bank's lobby. The air smelled faintly of leather and fresh flowers, and the faint murmur of low voices floated above the gentle hum of computers and machines. Everything about the place exuded wealth, from the high ceilings to the abstract paintings decorating the walls, even down to the marble flooring that seemed to glow beneath the soft light. Ethan was dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans, blending into the background as much as possible. He could have worn one of his custom-tailored suits, the ones that sat in his closet gathering dust, but that wasn't the point today. He wanted to see how this bank, the institution that benefited from his investments, treated people when they thought they were nobody.
He scanned the room. Employees greeted clients, most of them in sharp suits and dresses, with smiles and deferential nods, quickly securing their attention. He let out a quiet breath, shoved his hands into his pockets, and made his way to the front desk. Behind the counter, a young man in a crisp shirt and tie was engrossed in a conversation with his colleague, barely glancing at the line forming in front of them. Paul, his name tag read. Ethan approached and stood a few feet away, waiting to be acknowledged. A minute passed. Then 2. "Excuse me," Ethan said quietly, though his voice was firm enough to catch attention. Paul didn't look up, his fingers tapping on the keyboard. Ethan glanced around, noticing how quickly other employees were addressing the needs of the white customers who entered after him. A knot began to form in his stomach, but he stayed calm, watching Paul with patient eyes. Finally, Paul glanced up, his expression betraying a flicker of annoyance as if he'd been interrupted during something much more important. "Yeah, just a second," he muttered, his voice clipped. Then, without waiting for a response, his attention snapped back to the screen in front of him. Ethan felt the heat rise in his chest, but he didn't let it show. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated like this, and unfortunately, it wouldn't be the last. He leaned slightly forward, trying again. "I've been waiting for a while. I just need to resolve an issue with my account." Paul sighed, the exaggerated kind, like the weight of the world had just landed on his shoulders. "Fine. What's your account number?" His fingers hovered lazily over the keyboard, but it was clear his interest wasn't in helping Ethan. It was in getting back to whatever mundane task he had been doing before. As Ethan gave Paul the information, he noticed a woman standing behind the counter, Paul's colleague, whisper something to him. Her eyes darted to Ethan, and though the words were inaudible, the meaning was clear. "Another one of them." The way she said it, her voice laced with that dismissive tone Ethan had heard so many times before, made his stomach turn. The faint smile that twitched at the corners of Paul's mouth only confirmed it. Ethan's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He wasn't surprised, just tired. The memories began flooding in. He could still hear his mentor's voice, telling him what he had known for years. "You'll have to be 10 times better than them, Ethan. It's not fair, but they'll judge you by your skin before they ever see your talent. So you rise above it." She was right. He had risen above it, but it didn't make moments like this any easier. Ethan shifted his weight, glancing around the room. The other customers were getting quick, friendly service, especially the white clients, who were greeted with the kind of energy and politeness that made Ethan feel like a ghost in comparison. Minutes passed, and Paul's indifferent attitude continued to wear on Ethan. His patience was thinning, but he didn't want to give Paul the satisfaction of seeing him demoralized. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Paul mumbled, "I'll need to get my manager to approve this. Wait here." Paul disappeared into the back, leaving Ethan standing awkwardly at the counter while the whispers between the other bank employees continued. Claire, the branch manager, was behind the frosted glass door of her office, speaking animatedly on the phone, clearly unaware or unconcerned about what was happening in the lobby. Another 10 minutes passed. The white woman behind him was ushered to the counter, and within moments, she was receiving the attention Ethan had been denied for the better part of an hour. He felt the familiar sting of being ignored. It was as if all his success, his wealth, his hard-earned accomplishments meant nothing because they couldn't be seen at a glance. Ethan's patience snapped. He walked directly to Claire's desk, where she was still on the phone, her voice filled with the sharp, commanding tones of someone who saw themselves as important. She didn't look up as Ethan approached, so he stood there, his hands resting lightly on the edge of her desk. It took her another minute to acknowledge him. When she finally hung up, she looked up with a raised brow. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "I've been waiting for quite a while," Ethan replied, keeping his tone calm. "I've had an issue with my account, and it's been over an hour without any proper assistance." Claire barely glanced at the screen in front of her. "I'm a bit busy right now," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "If you wait a little longer, I'll have someone help you." It was the same pattern. Dismissed, brushed off like he didn't matter. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "No, I've been waiting long enough. I think I deserve a little more attention than that." Claire blinked, the irritation clear in her eyes. "Look, I understand you're frustrated, but we have protocols to follow. You'll just have to wait your turn." Ethan straightened, his voice firm but calm. "Respect isn't given freely, right? Well, I've earned mine, and I'll wait no longer." The bank lobby buzzed with activity, but for Ethan time seemed to stand still. The minutes dragged on, and with each passing second, he couldn't have felt more invisible. From his position point near Claire's office, he saw other clients being assisted, each interaction smooth, quick, and courteous. A middle-aged man in a suit had been greeted with a handshake, his needs addressed immediately. A young woman had barely stepped through the door before being escorted to the counter by a smiling employee. Yet, here he stood. Ethan had spent a lifetime fighting to be seen for his abilities, his intellect, and his success. But here, in this bank where his investments held substantial weight, he was reduced to just another face, one they deemed unimportant. Finally, Claire reappeared from her office. She was speaking on her phone again, her voice sharp and commanding, oblivious to the growing frustration in the lobby. Ethan approached her desk for the second time. Claire hung up her phone with a heavy sigh, not even looking up as Ethan stood directly in front of her. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," he said. Claire barely glanced up. "I told you, I'll get to you when I can," she said, her tone clipped. "We're very busy right now." Ethan's patience snapped. His words cut through the air like a blade. "Do you know who I am?" Claire blinked, taken aback by the sudden intensity in his voice. For the first time, she looked him over, really looked at him. She furrowed her brow, her expression a mix of annoyance and confusion. "I don't see why that matters," she replied with a dismissive wave of her hand. "You're just a client, and I've got procedures to follow." Ethan stepped closer, his voice cold but steady. "I'm not just another client. I'm Ethan Moore. I am your largest investor, the one responsible for much of the funding that keeps this branch running." For a moment, there was only silence. Claire's eyes widened in disbelief, her face draining of color. She stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the weight of what he had just said. Behind them, Paul stopped in his tracks, his usual indifference replaced with shock. Blood drained from his face as he realized who Ethan really was. Claire stammered, I didn't know. I didn't realize." Ethan cut her off, his voice still calm but filled with outrage. "You didn't bother to know. From the moment I walked in here, I was treated as if I was beneath you, dismissed, ignored, and all because I didn't look the part you expected." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She cast a quick, desperate glance at Paul, who was now awkwardly fiddling with a stack of papers, avoiding eye contact with Ethan altogether. Ethan's gaze shifted to Paul. "You too," he said, his voice sharp. "From the second I approached you, you made it clear that I wasn't worth your time." Paul looked up, his face a mask of guilt. I didn't know, Mr. Moore. I didn't mean—" "Exactly," Ethan interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "You didn't know, and you didn't care enough to find out. All you saw was my clothes, my skin, and you made a judgment. That's the problem here, not just with you, but with this entire bank." Paul's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He stood there, looking like a man who had just realized the full weight of his actions. Ethan turned back to Claire, who was still frozen, her eyes wide with fear. "I deserve better," he said, his voice firm, but controlled. "And so does every single person who walks through those doors. This bank has a culture problem, a systemic problem. And it starts with people like you." Claire swallowed hard, finally finding her voice. I'm so sorry, Mr. Moore. If I had known who you were—" "That's exactly the issue," Ethan shot back, his voice filled with quiet anger. "It shouldn't matter who I am. Whether I'm your largest investor or someone with $50 in their account, the treatment should be the same. You built a system where respect is only given to those you deem worthy. That's going to change. Today." Before Claire could respond, the sound of clicking cameras filled the air. Ethan turned toward the entrance where a small group of reporters had gathered, their cameras aimed squarely at him. The media had caught wind of the confrontation, and now they were eager to document every moment of it. Ethan took a deep breath. He knew this moment could either be a distraction or a powerful platform to shed light on the bigger issue at hand. Ethan stepped outside, the cool air hitting his face as he faced the growing crowd of reporters. Microphones were thrust toward him, and the questions began flying. "What happened inside?" "Are you really the bank's largest investor? Do you think this reflects a wider issue in corporate America?" Ethan raised a hand, quieting the crowd. His heart pounded in his chest, but his voice was calm and steady as he spoke. "This isn't just about one bad experience," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "What happened inside that bank is a reflection of a much larger issue. It's about how people are judged the moment they walk through the door. It's about who we decide deserves respect and who we choose to dismiss." The reporters listened intently, their cameras flashing. This bank, and many like it, have built cultures that prioritize appearances over substance. That's not just wrong, it's dangerous, and it's time for that to change. Everyone, regardless of how they look or how much money they have, deserves to be treated with dignity. Behind him, he could see Claire and Paul watching through the glass doors, their faces pale with realization. Ethan wasn't just speaking for himself now. He was speaking for every person who had been marginalized by institutions that claimed to serve them. As the cameras clicked and the reporters jotted down his every word, Ethan turned back toward the bank. He looked Claire and Paul squarely in the eyes through the glass. "You don't get to hide behind apologies anymore," he said, his voice firm. "It's time to take a hard look at the culture you've built and decide if you're willing to make real change." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan knew that change wouldn't come quickly, but it had to start somewhere. And today, it would begin with him. The next day, Ethan sat in Vista Trust's glass-walled boardroom, surrounded by the bank's senior leadership. The mood in the room was detectable, tense, anxious, and filled with slight panic. The bank's stock had taken a hit in the wake of yesterday's incident, and the board members were scrambling to control the damage. At the head of the table, Rachel Quinn, the bank's no-nonsense chairwoman, scanned the room with a look that demanded silence. "We are not here to point fingers," she said, in a voice that cut through the murmurs. "We are here to find solutions. This situation with Mr. Moore has put us in a precarious position, and we need to know how we move forward." All eyes turned to Ethan, who sat calmly at the opposite end of the table. Since the incident, he had received countless calls and messages from the board members, each pleading for his input on how to salvage the bank's reputation. But Ethan wasn't interested in saving their image. He was here to demand real change. Ethan leaned forward, his fingers laced together on the table. "It's not about PR," he said, his voice even and firm. "What happened yesterday is a symptom of a much deeper problem. The culture of this bank is broken, and until you address that, nothing will change." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Ethan wasn't finished. "I'm not here to sweep this under the rug. If you want my help, it starts with accountability, real accountability." Rachel raised an eyebrow, her fierce gaze fixed on him. "And what does real accountability look like to you, Mr. Moore?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "It starts with training, comprehensive, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, from the tellers to the executives. It's not enough to say you're committed to inclusivity, you need to prove it with actions." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But training isn't enough. You need measurable goals. Every department should have clear metrics for diversity and equity, and those who fail to meet them should face consequences. If you're serious about change, it can't be optional." Meanwhile, in the same building but far from the boardroom, Claire sat in her office, her world crumbling around her. She had already been informed that her termination was imminent. Her once confident behavior had vanished, replaced with the unmistakable weight of regret. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder at Vista Trust, but in just one day, her career had been shattered by her arrogance and failure to treat others with basic respect. The knock on her door startled her. She looked up to see Paul standing in the doorway, his face drawn and tense. She waved him in, though she had little energy left for conversation. "I just came to, I don't know, check in," Paul said, his voice quiet. He glanced around the office, which already felt like a place she no longer belonged. "I heard about your termination." Claire's lips thinned into a tight line. "It's over, Paul," she said, bitterness creeping into her voice. "I'm being escorted out by the end of the day." Paul hesitated, shifting from foot to foot. "Claire, I've been thinking about what happened yesterday. About how we treated Ethan, Mr. Moore. We messed up, and it wasn't just a one-time thing. This culture, the way we've been acting, it's wrong." Claire's face twisted in frustration. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't been replaying every moment in my head since it happened? I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem," Paul replied, his voice firmer now. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. We treated him like he was nothing because we made assumptions based on how he looked. And now, look where we are." Claire didn't have an answer. She looked away, knowing that her career, and the way she had built it, was over. Back in the boardroom, Ethan continued to outline his vision for how the bank could begin to repair the damage, not just to its reputation, but also to its culture. "You need transparency," he said. "Clients and employees need to know that this bank is committed to change. Publish your diversity reports, show progress, or show where you're failing. If people don't see tangible improvement, they'll know it's all for show." One of the senior executives, a man in his 40s with glasses that perpetually slid down his nose, raised a hand. "We've had programs before, but they've never really worked," he said, his voice filled with skepticism. "What makes this different?" Ethan looked him square in the eye. "Accountability," he said. "Those programs were designed to check a box. They weren't designed to actually change anything. This time, it has to be different. If you don't follow through, there will be consequences. Financial, legal, and reputational." The room was silent as the board members digested his words. They knew Ethan was right. The usual half-hearted attempts at diversity wouldn't be enough to undo the damage that had been done. Finally, Rachel spoke up again. "We'll do it," she said, her tone resolute. "Vista Trust will commit to the changes you've outlined, Mr. Moore. We can't afford not to." Later that day, Paul found Ethan in the bank's lobby. He approached slowly, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Mr. Moore," Paul began awkwardly, I wanted to apologize for the way I treated you yesterday." Ethan turned to face him, his expression unreadable. He remained silent, waiting for Paul to continue. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Paul went on, his voice low, "about how it's not just about what happened yesterday, it's about the bigger issue, the culture here, the way we've been operating. It's not right. And I've been part of that." Ethan nodded, but he didn't offer any reassurances. He listened, giving Paul the space to wrestle with his own realizations. "I've decided to leave the bank," Paul said, the words coming out in a rush. "I need to step away from this environment. I want to do something that actually makes a difference. Maybe work for a nonprofit or something in social justice. I don't know yet, but I can't stay here." Ethan's gaze softened slightly. "It's a start," he said. "Real change doesn't happen overnight, but recognizing the problem is the first step." Paul nodded, relief flashing across his face. "Thank you. For everything." As Ethan left the bank for the last time that day, the cool breeze hit his face, carrying with it a sense of clarity and hope. The last 24 hours had been intense, but they had also been transformative. He knew that the road ahead would be long and that real change wouldn't come easily. But he had done what he set out to do. He had made his voice heard, and he had held an institution accountable. More than that, he had laid the groundwork for something bigger than himself. It wasn't just about reclaiming his dignity. It was about ensuring that others wouldn't have to fight the same battles he had. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a sense of hope. He had sparked a change within Vista Trust, and perhaps, if others followed suit, they could ignite change in corporate America as a whole. As he walked away, Ethan knew one thing for sure: the fight for equality and respect wasn't over, but it had taken a significant step forward today. Elena Martinez sat at a small candle-lit table in the corner of La Palma, a cozy restaurant in the heart of downtown. The warm amber glow from the overhead lights softened the edges of the room, casting a serene light over the diners. The gentle hum of conversation blended with the clinking of silverware, creating a peaceful, almost melodic backdrop. The aroma of freshly baked bread, garlic, and herbs wafted through the air, charming Elena into a rare moment of relaxation. She let out a contented sigh, swirling the last of her red wine in her glass. After a brutal week in court, defending clients who had faced unjust systems of power, she felt proud, yet exhausted. This dinner was her way of marking the end of another long week, another series of battles fought on behalf of those who didn't have the means to fight for themselves. She had just finished signing the check when the restaurant door swung open abruptly, the sudden burst of cold air cutting through the warm, comfortable atmosphere. The chatter around her dulled as several heads turned to the entrance. Standing in the doorway was Officer Jack Reynolds, his sharp blue uniform gleaming under the restaurant's lighting. He scanned the room with a tight, focused expression. His eyes landed on Elena almost instantly. Elena noticed the shift in the room's energy. There was something about Officer Reynolds' presence that set her on edge. She furrowed her brow, unsure why he was here, why he was staring directly at her. Her stomach knotted as he began to make his way toward her. "Can I help you, officer?" Elena called out, her voice calm. Officer Reynolds stopped at her table, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at her glass of wine and the barely touched plate of pasta. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but cold. "We need to talk, Miss Martinez." "About what?" Elena asked, keeping her voice steady despite the odd knot of anxiety twisting in her chest. "You were seen earlier today in an area known for drug activity," Officer Reynolds said, his words cold and clipped. "We need to ask you some questions." Elena blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" she replied. "I'm a lawyer, officer. What you're suggesting doesn't make any sense." "Being a lawyer doesn't put you above the law," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Elena's heart began to pound, but she kept her expression composed. "I'm well aware of the law," she said, carefully reaching into her purse to pull out her ID. "I spent the day in court and then came straight here." She handed him her driver's license, her work ID, and the badge identifying her as a defense attorney in the city. Reynolds took them, his face unreadable as he inspected the cards. For a brief moment, she thought that would be the end of it. But as he handed them back, he muttered, "Doesn't mean much to me. People like you always think you're untouchable?" Her breath caught in her throat. People like you. It wasn't subtle, not in the least. Elena could feel the eyes of the other diners. A couple at a nearby table exchanged nervous glances while a waiter who had been passing by hesitated mid-step, unsure whether to intervene or not. Elena drew in a slow, measured breath, willing herself to stay calm. "Officer, I'm not sure what kind of assumptions you're making, but I've done nothing wrong, and frankly, this line of questioning is inappropriate." But Reynolds wasn't bothered. "Why were you in that area?" he asked, his voice rising slightly, drawing even more attention. "You must have known it's a known hotspot for illegal activity." Elena clenched her fists under the table, anger and humiliation warring inside her. She had spent her career defending people who had been unjustly accused, and now here she was, in the same position. "You're making this assumption because of my race," she said, her voice calm but firm. She refused to let the hurt show. "This is racial profiling, plain and simple. You saw me and decided I didn't belong in this part of town. I'm sure you wouldn't be questioning me if I didn't look the way I do?" Reynolds's face remained cold. "Look, I'm just doing my job," he shot back. "If you have nothing to hide, why are you making this a big deal?" At that, Elena stood up. She felt the blood rushing to her face, the weight of the stares from the surrounding tables pressing in on her. "This is a big deal because you're accusing me of something I didn't do, based on nothing more than where I was and what I look like. I demand to speak to your supervisor." Reynolds' posture stiffened. For a moment it seemed like he might relent, but then his jaw set. "This is a waste of my time," he muttered, dismissively turning away from her. "Go ahead, make your complaint, but it won't change anything." Elena stood frozen, her hand shaking as she gathered her things. As soon as Reynolds left the restaurant, the murmurs around the room swelled to a low roar. She could feel the judgment in the glances cast her way, some sympathetic, some skeptical. Pulling out her phone, Elena stepped outside into the night air and quickly dialed her best friend, Sophia. "Hey, Elena! What's up?" Elena hesitated for a moment, the weight of what had just happened sinking in fully now that she was standing in the quiet night. "Sophia, you won't believe what just happened." "What? Are you okay?" Sophia's voice sharpened with worry. Elena recounted the entire ordeal. "He didn't care who I was, Sophia. He saw me, saw where I was, and made up his mind that I didn't belong there." "That's unbelievable," Sophia replied, her voice tight with frustration. "You need to report him, file a formal complaint." "You can't let him get away with it," Sophia insisted. "This isn't just about you, Elena. It's about every person who's ever been treated like this and didn't have the voice or the position to fight back." Sophia was right. She couldn't let this go, not when she had the power to do something about it. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm with determination. "I'll file the complaint. This can't keep happening." The following day, Elena Martinez stood at the steps of the Central City Police Department, the imposing stone building looming above her. She had spent most of the night replaying the confrontation with Officer Reynolds in her mind. It wasn't just about what happened to her. It was about racial profiling and systemic injustice that affected so many in her community. She took a deep breath and pushed through the heavy glass doors, stepping into the stark, sterile interior of the police station. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, casting a harsh white glow over the sleek linoleum floors. Elena approached the desk, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. A bored-looking officer sat behind the counter, barely glancing up from his phone. "Help you with something?" he muttered, his tone indifferent. Elena straightened her shoulders, speaking clearly. "I'd like to file a formal complaint against Officer Jack Reynolds for misconduct. I need to speak to someone from Internal Affairs." The officer raised an eyebrow, his gaze finally lifting from the phone. "Reynolds, huh? What's this about?" "It's a matter of racial profiling and abuse of authority," Elena said firmly, her voice steady. "I need to speak to someone who can take this seriously." The officer's expression shifted slightly, more out of curiosity than respect, and he reluctantly pushed a button on the desk phone, mumbling something into the receiver. After a moment, he motioned toward a side door. "Internal Affairs is that way. They're expecting you." Elena was led through a narrow hallway, her mind racing as she prepared to recount the incident once again. The walls were lined with commendations and photos of past officers, but to her, they seemed like relics of a system she was about to challenge. She soon found herself standing in a modest office with Sergeant Amanda Reyes, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s. Reyes was known for her firm but fair approach to handling police misconduct cases. She had a reputation for getting to the bottom of things. "Ms. Martinez, thank you for coming in," Reyes said as she stood from her desk, extending a hand. Her tone was professional, though there was an underlying warmth that made Elena feel slightly more at ease. "I understand you're here to file a complaint regarding Officer Reynolds. Please, have a seat." Elena sat down, carefully placing the folder she had brought on the edge of the desk. Inside were her detailed notes from the previous night. "Yes, I am," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't just about a misunderstanding or a minor inconvenience. Officer Reynolds accused me of being involved in criminal activity based solely on the fact that I was in a certain part of town. He dismissed my identity as an attorney, and the only reason he approached me was because of my race." Reyes listened intently, her pen moving swiftly across a notepad. "And what exactly happened during this encounter? The more details you can provide, the better." Elena recounted the incident in full, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. She described the initial accusation, Reynolds' dismissiveness when she presented her ID, and the weight of his words. "People like you think you're untouchable." As she spoke, she could see Sergeant Reyes's expression shift. "That's troubling," Reyes said, tapping her pen against the desk. "Do you have any witnesses or other evidence to corroborate your account?" Elena nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "Yes, there were several customers in the restaurant who saw what happened. I'm sure some of them would be willing to provide statements. There's also security footage from the restaurant that should show how the situation escalated." Reyes leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "That would be extremely helpful. It's one thing to have a claim, but we need solid evidence to build a case strong enough to take action against an officer. I'll need you to reach out to those witnesses and, if possible, obtain a copy of the security footage. In the meantime, we'll start an internal review of Officer Reynolds' conduct." Elena had been prepared to face resistance, but Reyes's focus and professionalism gave her hope. This wasn't just going to be another complaint lost in the system. "I'll gather everything I can," Elena promised. "I'm not going to let this go. Too many people are afraid to speak up, and it's time that changes." Officer Jack Reynolds sat in the break room on the other side of the precinct. His hands were wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee, the room's low murmur of conversation filling the silence. "Can you believe he accused an attorney?" one officer said, shaking his head. "That's reckless." Jack's jaw tightened. He had been sure he was doing his job, enforcing the law as he saw fit. But now he wasn't so sure. The incident kept replaying in his mind. The way he had approached her, how he dismissed her credentials. He hadn't thought much about it at the moment. He was trained to act, not think. But now, the consequences were closing in. That evening, Elena attended a community meeting at St. Peter's Church. The room was filled with the familiar faces of community members discussing education reform and local policing. Elena sat toward the back at first, listening as people exchanged ideas and frustrations. She knew the challenges her community faced all too well. Many had suffered far worse than she had in her encounter with Officer Reynolds. For many in the room, systemic injustice wasn't just an abstract idea, it was a daily reality. After a while, the moderator called for an open discussion, and Elena felt like sharing what had happened in the previous days. As she stepped up to the small podium, the room grew quiet, and all eyes turned to her. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began. "I want to share something that happened to me recently, an incident with a police officer that shook me to my core." She recounted the story, detailing her encounter with Officer Reynolds and his blatant dismissal of her as a professional simply because of her race. As she spoke, she saw nods of recognition from several people in the room. They understood. They had lived it too. "This isn't just my story," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. "It's a story that many of you might relate to. But we cannot afford to stay silent any longer. It's time we stand together against this kind of injustice." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. A woman in her early 40s stood up from the back of the room, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I faced something similar last year," she said, her voice trembling. "Stopped for no reason. Accused of something I didn't do. It's like they see us as less than human." Elena felt a surge of solidarity. This was bigger than her fight. It was about the collective experience of a community that had been ignored and mistreated for too long. That night, as Elena lay in bed, she felt a quiet sense of peace. For the first time since the encounter with Officer Reynolds, she didn't feel powerless. She was no longer just reacting to what had happened to her. She was taking control of the narrative. The morning of the hearing was filled with tension. City Hall, where the public hearing would take place, was filled with reporters, community members, and police officers. The marble floors echoed with the shuffling of feet, hushed conversations, and the clicking of cameras. The case against Officer Jack Reynolds had attracted significant attention in the days leading up to the hearing, with local media outlets covering every angle. The issue of racial profiling within the city's police force had become a hot topic, sparking debates in homes, on talk shows, and in the streets. Elena Martinez arrived at the courthouse early, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering witness statements, security footage, and evidence that would corroborate her account of that humiliating evening. Now, it was time to face the system that had wronged her. As she stepped through the courthouse doors, she was greeted by her lawyer, Sarah Caldwell, a sharp, relentless civil rights attorney who had handled cases like this many times before. "Elena, you ready?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but focused. Elena nodded, her grip tightening on the folder. "I'm ready. Let's do this." The public hearing took place in a large room at the back of City Hall. A long wooden table sat at the front, where members of the Internal Affairs Board and community representatives presided over the hearing. Officer Jack Reynolds sat to the left, his face pale. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, occasionally glancing around the room as if searching for an escape. As Elena walked in, she could feel the eyes of the audience upon her. She felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the many others who had experienced similar injustices but had been too afraid or powerless to fight back. When Lieutenant Michael Hale, the board chair, called the hearing to order, the low murmur of the crowd subsided into silence. Elena took her seat at the witness stand, and for a moment she allowed herself to steady her breath. This was it. Lieutenant Hale spoke first, his voice even but firm. "We're here today to address the allegations of misconduct brought against Officer Jack Reynolds. Ms. Martinez, as the complainant, you may begin by giving your testimony." Elena cleared her throat and began. "Thank you, Lieutenant Hale and members of the board. I stand here today not just for myself, but for every person who has faced racial profiling and abuse of authority by those who are meant to protect us. She recounted the events of the night at the restaurant, describing in painstaking detail how Officer Reynolds had singled her out, dismissed her identity as a lawyer, and publicly humiliated her. She looked directly at Officer Reynolds, who kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. When Officer Reynolds approached me that night, he didn't see a lawyer, or even a person. He saw a suspect, someone who, in his mind, didn't belong where I was, simply because of my race. I wasn't given the benefit of the doubt. I was judged, dismissed, and stripped of my dignity in front of a room full of people. The room was silent as her words hung in the air. The gravity of her experience, shared in such a public setting, seemed to weigh on everyone present. "I know this isn't just about me," Elena continued, her voice steady. "This is about a pattern, one that's been allowed to persist within our police department for far too long. I've spoken to others in my community, and I've heard the same stories time and time again. We are stopped, questioned, and treated as criminals because of the color of our skin. It's time that changes." When it was Officer Reynolds' turn to speak, he stood hesitantly. He glanced briefly at Elena, then quickly looked away. "I didn't mean for things to get out of hand," he began, his voice subdued. "I was just doing my job, following procedure. I didn't realize who she was at the time. That's exactly the problem," Elena interjected, her voice rising. The room stirred as she spoke out, cutting through his weak defense. "It shouldn't matter who I am. You shouldn't have treated me differently just because I'm a lawyer. The fact that you didn't realize speaks to your bias. You saw me as guilty before you even knew my name." The board members shifted in their seats. Officer Reynolds' face flushed red, his gaze dropping to the floor. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. "You have to understand, Officer Reynolds," Elena continued, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about a single mistake. It's about a system that allows you to act on your biases without consequences. You didn't question why you made that assumption about me, but you should have." After several hours of testimony from witnesses and legal arguments, the Internal Affairs Board adjourned for deliberation. The tension in the room was thick, but Elena felt a sense of calm. She had done everything she could. Now it was in the board's hands. When they returned, Lieutenant Hale read the verdict. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony from both parties, we have determined that Officer Jack Reynolds engaged in conduct unbecoming of a police officer. His actions were not only unprofessional but indicative of a bias that has no place in our police force." The crowd murmured in approval as Hale continued. "As a result, Officer Reynolds will be suspended without pay, and a formal investigation into broader patterns of misconduct within the department will be launched." Later that week, the city held a rally for justice. The community had rallied behind Elena, and she was invited to speak at the event. The crowd at the rally was larger than she had expected, with hundreds of people gathered in the city square, holding signs that read, "End racial profiling," and "Justice for all." The fight had been long, and there was still so much work to be done, but this was a moment of victory, a moment that proved change was possible. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This is not the end of our fight. It's just the beginning. Together we can hold those in power accountable. Together we can ensure that every person in this city is treated with dignity and respect." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices a powerful chorus of hope and determination. As she continued her speech, she saw a familiar figure standing at the back of the crowd, Officer Jack Reynolds. For a brief moment their eyes met, and in that fleeting connection, Elena hoped he had learned something. Perhaps in time, he too would become part of the change she was fighting for. As she looked back on her journey, Elena knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready. This was just the beginning, and she was determined to keep fighting. For her community, for justice, and for a future where no one would have to fear those sworn to protect them. The midday heat was relentless. The sun blazed down on the small southern town, making the air feel heavy and thick. The town was quiet, almost sleepy, as the few people who dared to step outside hurried between air-conditioned stores or restaurants. The heat pressed down like a weight, making even the simplest movements exhausting. Officer Mark Steele sat in his patrol car parked near the main road, sipping cold coffee from a plastic cup. The air conditioner hummed, struggling to keep the car cool. Mark wiped the sweat from his forehead. Days like this dragged on forever. There were no calls, no emergencies, not even a minor traffic violation to break the monotony. Just heat, silence, and endless waiting. Mark had been with the local police department for over a decade. He knew every street, every alley, and almost everyone in town. Despite his experience, something had always made him sad, a feeling that his hard work wasn't appreciated, that others looked down on him, and he hated it. He hated how people like the town mayor or business owners, with their fancy cars and well-pressed suits, acted as if they were better than him. Mark saw himself as a man who had worked his way up, one who knew what real struggle was. The soft beep of the radar cut through the silence. His eyes snapped to the screen. 72 miles per hour. The speed limit on this stretch was 55. A hint of excitement rushed in him. Finally, something to do. Mark squinted through the dusty windshield and saw a sleek, black SUV speeding down the road. It glistened in the heat, almost like a mirage, its polished surface reflecting the sun. "Here we go," Mark muttered to himself, tossing the half-empty cup into the holder and flipping on his lights. His patrol car roared to life as he pulled out, his tires kicking up small clouds of dust. As he closed in on the speeding SUV, Mark could feel a sense of satisfaction creeping in. His day was about to get interesting. The SUV didn't slow down right away, but Mark wasn't worried. Nobody outran the police in this town. He'd dealt with speeders before, and this was just another one. He turned up the siren, the sharp sound slicing through the still air. Eventually, the SUV pulled over to the side of the road, rolling to a stop beneath the shadow of a large oak tree. Mark pulled up behind it, his patrol car coming to a sharp halt. He took a deep breath, adjusted his belt and hat, and stepped out into the oppressive heat. The air outside was worse than inside his car, thick and suffocating. The SUV's door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a well-fitted dark blue suit. He moved calmly, almost too calmly for Mark's liking, and stood by the side of the vehicle, waiting. "License and registration," Mark demanded, his voice sharp and practiced. He didn't bother making eye contact, already assuming this would be like every other stop, an excuse or some argument. The man reached into his pocket without hesitation and pulled out his ID and registration, handing them over without a word. Mark took the documents and glanced down at the name on the license. "General Alexander Hayes," he read aloud, his voice stuttering slightly. Mark knew that name. He had seen it on the news several times before. General Hayes was a highly decorated military veteran who was praised for his leadership in several overseas operations. Mark's hand trembled slightly as he processed the name, but he quickly regained his composure. A strange mixture of emotions welled up inside him. Surprise, anger, and most of all, resentment. Mark didn't care who this man was. To him, Hayes was just another guy who thought he could do whatever he wanted because of his status. Mark had seen it before. Wealthy, successful people who thought the rules didn't apply to them. People like Hayes didn't know what it meant to struggle, to fight for every inch. Mark had fought. He had earned his place. People like Hayes had everything handed to them. "You know you broke the law," Mark said harshly, looking up at Hayes for the first time. His eyes were hard, his tone accusing. The title of general didn't matter to him. Not out here. Not today. Hayes remained calm. He didn't argue or make excuses. Instead, he nodded slightly. "Speeding," he said in a calm tone. "I'm aware." That calmness made Mark's blood boil. There was no fear in Hayes's voice, no sign of remorse. He was too controlled, too sure of himself. Mark clenched his jaw, feeling the frustration grow inside him. This guy thought he was untouchable, that just because he was a general, he could get away with anything. "Put your hands on the car," Mark ordered, his voice louder than necessary. Hayes paused for a moment, clearly surprised by the sudden escalation, but after a beat, he complied. He turned slowly and placed his hands on the roof of the SUV, his back facing Mark. Still, there was no resistance, no defiance, just calm acceptance. But for Mark, it wasn't enough. The anger inside him was bubbling to the surface. He wanted to see something crack in Hayes's calm demeanor, something that showed he wasn't as perfect as everyone thought. This was his chance, his moment to claim control. Mark grabbed Hayes's wrist and twisted his arm behind his back, rougher than he needed to. Hayes winced but didn't resist. He turned his head slightly, looking back at Mark with an unreadable expression. "What's this about?" Hayes asked, his voice still steady, though there was a note of warning in it. "We're going to check if you've got anything illegal in the car," Mark snapped. He knew he didn't have grounds for it, but that didn't matter now. He had decided that Hayes was hiding something, and nothing would change his mind. Just then, another police car pulled up. Mark hadn't noticed it at first, but the new arrival was Lieutenant Reyes, one of the few officers Mark actually respected. Reyes stepped out of his vehicle and walked over, his face a mix of concern and confusion. "Mark, what's going on?" Reyes asked, his voice calm but firm. "Just detaining a violator," Mark grunted, still holding Hayes's wrist, preparing to cuff him. Reyes glanced at Hayes, and recognition flashed across his face. "That's General Hayes," he said slowly, his voice cautious. "So what?" Mark shot back, his tone defensive. He could feel the situation starting to slip out of his control, but he wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. Reyes stepped closer, his eyes flicking between Mark and Hayes. "Mark," he said, more quietly this time, "maybe we should slow down. This is General Hayes. Are you sure this is necessary?" Mark's heart raced. He had been so sure of himself just moments ago, but now, something felt wrong. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He had already gone too far, and stopping now would feel like defeat. "It doesn't matter who he is," Mark snapped. "No one's above the law." Reyes hesitated, clearly trying to figure out the best way to de-escalate the situation. He had known Mark for years, and understood how stubborn he could be, especially when his authority was challenged. But this wasn't just any traffic stop, and Reyes knew it. "Listen," Reyes said carefully, "I get that you're doing your job, but this might not be what you think. Let's just talk to him. There's no need to make this worse." Mark's grip tightened on Hayes's arm, his mind racing. Everything inside him screamed to keep pushing, to show Hayes that he wasn't untouchable. But Mark wasn't ready to listen to that voice yet. Mark Steele felt his heart pounding as he tightened his grip on General Hayes's wrist. The summer heat pressed down on him, but it was his frustration and anger that made his body tense. He had been so sure of himself moments ago, but now, with Lieutenant Reyes watching and the crowd beginning to gather, doubt started creeping in. His mind raced. He could hear the faint whisper of reason telling him to stop, to let this go before things got worse. But his pride and stubbornness drowned that voice out. "Mark!" Reyes said again, stepping closer. "You don't have to do this." Mark clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on the back of Hayes's head. "I've got this under control," he muttered through gritted teeth. Reyes was wrong. This guy, this calm, collected general, was just like all the others. People who thought their status made them untouchable. Mark wouldn't let that slide. Not today. The crowd was growing now. A few curious onlookers had started to gather across the street. Some had their phones out, filming the scene, which only made Mark feel more cornered. His frustration boiled. Why was everyone acting like this guy was a saint? He broke the law, and Mark was doing his job. It was that simple. But even as Mark tried to convince himself, he could feel the weight of the eyes on him. And General Hayes, standing there so calmly, made it all worse. He wasn't fighting back, wasn't yelling or resisting. Hayes turned his head slightly, his calm eyes meeting Mark's. "Officer Steele," Hayes said, his voice steady and clear, "I have done nothing wrong except speeding. You know that." Mark's face burned. There was no fear in Hayes's voice, no hesitation. It wasn't what he said that angered Mark. It was how he said it. Hayes wasn't trying to argue, but it felt like he was challenging Mark's authority all the same. "Shut up!" Mark snapped, his voice louder than intended. "You think you can just walk away from this? Not today." Who did this guy think he was, staying so calm when he should have been nervous or scared? A few feet away, Reyes shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension rising. "Mark, listen to me," Reyes said, his tone firmer now. "This is General Hayes. This man is a decorated war hero. Think about what you're doing." The word hero hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Hero. What about him? He had been serving this town for over a decade, dealing with criminals and risking his life, and yet no one called him a hero. People like Hayes got praise and recognition, while guys like Mark were left in the dust and forgotten. "I don't care who he is," Mark barked, glaring at Reyes. "He broke the law, and I'm going to deal with it." Reyes sighed, clearly frustrated. "Mark, you're making a mistake. Just let him go, we'll write him the ticket and that's it. There's no need for this to get worse." But Mark wasn't listening. He felt the crowd's eyes on him, the weight of the cameras recording his every move. Backing down now would feel like losing, and Mark wasn't about to lose. Not to this man, not in front of all these people. A sudden movement caught his eye. A car had pulled up on the opposite side of the street, and a man in a suit stepped out. He held a large camera, pointing it directly at Mark and Hayes. Mark's stomach sank. A journalist. Perfect. This was about to become a public spectacle. Before Mark could react, Hayes spoke again, his voice calm but carrying a sharp edge. "Officer Steele, I'm not resisting. I'm complying with everything you've asked. But if you think you can treat me this way because of who I am or what I look like, you're making a serious mistake." Mark's pulse quickened. His hands trembled as he tightened his grip on Hayes's arm. His mind raced, trying to hold on to the conviction that he was in control, that he was the one enforcing the law. But with each passing second, it felt like the situation was slipping further from his grasp. "No one's above the law," Mark growled, shoving Hayes harder against the car. "Not you, not anyone." Reyes stepped forward quickly, his hand on Mark's arm. "Mark, stop!" The words cut through the tension like a knife. Mark froze, his hand still gripping Hayes's wrist. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The heat, the crowd, the cameras. It all blurred as Mark's mind raced to figure out what to do next. Reyes's voice softened, though it still carried the weight of urgency. "Think about what you're doing, Mark. This isn't worth it. Let him go." Before Mark could make another move, Hayes spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "This will be your last mistake, Officer Steele. And not because I'm a general, but because I'm a citizen of this country with rights." The words hit Mark harder than he expected. Something in the way Hayes said it, so confident, so composed, shook him. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Mark's grip loosened, his mind spinning. He had to make a decision, but before he could, Reyes moved closer, his voice now filled with authority. "Mark, it's over. Let him go." Mark hesitated, his hand still resting on Hayes's wrist. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, toward the cameras, and finally toward Reyes. The small voice in the back of his head was louder now, telling him that if he kept pushing, he would lose everything, his career, his reputation, everything. Reluctantly, Mark released Hayes's arm and stepped back. Hayes straightened his suit jacket and turned to face Mark. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the officer with calm, steady eyes. But then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, Someone had to show you how to act properly." Mark's face burned with humiliation. He wanted to lash out, to say something, anything, to regain control. But nothing came out. The crowd watched in silence, the journalist's camera still rolling, capturing every moment. Without another word, Hayes turned, got back into his SUV, and drove away. Mark stood frozen in place, his fists clenched at his sides. Reyes sighed, putting his phone away. "You really went too far, Mark," he said quietly. Mark didn't respond. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, watching the black SUV disappear down the road. His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in years, Mark felt something he hadn't expected: fear of what might come next. When Mark Steele returned, the station was quieter than usual. The moment he walked in, he felt the glances and hushed whispers. His co-workers didn't say anything directly, but the silence spoke volumes. Mark could feel their judgment, the tension hanging in the air as thick as the humidity outside. His mind replayed the incident over and over again, each time heightening the sense of worry that had followed him ever since General Hayes had driven off. A part of him knew he had gone too far, but it wasn't until now, walking through the station, that the full gravity of the situation began to sink in. When Mark reached his desk, he dropped heavily into his chair and stared blankly at the stack of reports in front of him. The routine work usually helped clear his mind and gave him a way to focus. But today the papers blurred before his eyes, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push away the thoughts racing through his head. General Hayes, the crowd, the cameras, the way Reyes had looked at him, trying to warn him. Suddenly the door to the office opened, and Captain Howard stepped in, his face unreadable. Captain Howard wasn't one to meddle in his officers' affairs unless absolutely necessary. Howard didn't bother with small talk. He just gestured toward his office and said, "Steele, we need to talk. Now." Mark stood, feeling a chill run through him. He followed Howard down the hallway, each step slower than the last. The station felt like it was closing in on him. He could feel his colleagues' eyes burning into his back as he passed. Inside Captain Howard's office, the door closed with a soft click. Howard sat behind his desk, folding his hands in front of him. Mark stood stiffly, waiting for the blow he knew was coming. Howard sighed, his voice low but firm. "You know the video of your stop is all over the place, right?" Mark's stomach sank. He had been hoping, foolishly, that maybe things hadn't blown up the way he feared. But as soon as Howard mentioned the video, the last thread of hope slipped away. His actions were no longer just a mistake he could brush under the rug, they were public. Howard slid a printed headline across the desk. "Police Aggression Against National Hero. General Hayes's Shocking Encounter." Mark clenched his fists, the paper crumpling slightly in his hands. His name wasn't in the headline, but he didn't need it to be. He was the officer in that story, the face of the incident, the villain. Howard leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "You seriously thought this would just go away? That someone like General Hayes wouldn't use his influence?" His voice rose slightly, irritation creeping in. "This isn't just a small mistake, Steele. This is a PR disaster. We're getting calls from higher-ups, and you know what that means." Mark's chest tightened. He could barely breathe, the weight of Howard's words crashing down on him. Calls from higher-ups meant one thing: his job, his entire career, was on the line. "You're suspended," Howard said bluntly. "Effective immediately. There's going to be an investigation, and until it's over, you're off duty." "Captain, please," Mark began, his voice strained. "This was a misunderstanding. I acted within the law. Maybe I went too far, but—" "A misunderstanding?" Howard cut him off, standing from his desk. "Have you seen the news, Steele? This isn't about you going a little overboard. The media is spinning the narrative on racial profiling. This is about police aggression. This is about General Hayes, a national hero, and you're nobody, Steele." Mark's breath fastened. Nobody. The word stung more than anything else Howard had said. Howard was right. Hayes was someone people looked up to and admired. And what was Mark? Just a cop from a small town with a temper. Howard's voice softened slightly. Go home, Steele. Think about what happens next. You need to prepare yourself because this isn't going away. Mark didn't argue. He couldn't. He rose slowly from his chair, his legs feeling weak beneath him. The hallway felt longer than before, the silence more deafening. When Mark finally stepped outside, the hot, sticky air hit him like a wave. It did nothing to clear his head. He drove home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind was racing. The suspension, the investigation, the fact that the whole world seemed to be turning against him. When he got home, the house felt cold and empty. He collapsed onto the couch, trying to process everything, but his thoughts wouldn't stop spinning. He grabbed the remote and flipped on the TV, hoping to drown out the noise in his head. But as soon as the screen came to life, his heart skipped a beat. There, on the screen, was General Hayes, sitting calmly in a studio, giving an interview. He looked as composed as ever, his voice steady, as if he was discussing any ordinary topic. But the words he spoke cut through Mark like a knife. This isn't just about one officer's mistake, Hayes said, looking directly into the camera. This is a reflection of a larger issue, of how deeply rooted bias is in our system. And if we don't address it, we're going to keep seeing incidents like this, again and again. Mark's hand trembled as he turned off the TV. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Lieutenant Reyes. Mark answered, his voice flat. Yeah? Mark, Reyes said, his voice tense. I've got bad news. The department is launching a full investigation and reviewing all your cases from the past few years. Mark's heart dropped. All my cases, he repeated, his voice hollow. All of them, Reyes confirmed. Reyes trailed off, but Mark didn't need him to finish. He knew what this meant. His career, his life, everything he had built, it was all about to come crashing down. The call ended, and Mark sat in silence, staring at his phone. The walls of his house seemed to close in on him. He had been in control, or at least he had thought he was, but now everything was going out of control, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Days passed, each one worse than the last. The news continued to report on the incident, showing new clips of the video and zooming in on Mark's face. The comments online were brutal, filled with anger and outrage. The town had turned on him. People he used to greet on the street now avoided him. His neighbors no longer said hello. He was alone, isolated. The final blow came one afternoon when Mark received the mail that his suspension would become permanent due to racial profiling. At that moment, Mark knew he had lost everything he had spent over a decade building. All because of his bias,